How did working people around the world survive COVID-19? When the pandemic hit their countries, what were their working conditions and wages like? What plans do governments and international organizations have for post COVID 19 economic recovery? Do those plans really benefit working people? Join the conversation in this series on Workers of the World After COVID 19, brought to you by the Law Development and Conflicts Research Group at the University of Westminster.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Workers of the World after COVID-19. Uh, and today we are going to talk about Philippines. And we have with us Kara and Rochelle, who have agreed to talk us through what is happening in the Philippines around the work and the workers, both before and after COVID-19. Thank you so much, Kara and Rochelle, for agreeing to do this and for taking time out and joining us today. Uh, so, the first question that I want to ask both of you is that could you just give us a brief overview of the national context in the context of course, like work and the condition of workers and also activism in the Philippines? I'm going to hand over to you, Kara, to start with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here to be sharing the context and the conditions of the Filipino workers and the people. Even before the pandemic, it's the workers' movement and the Filipino movement have been calling for accountability from the government because of its misprioritization of its policies. In the main, the government has prioritized economic policies that allow the economy to be open to um, foreign direct investments, to allow a lot of companies to invest in the Philippines, if that causes the policies at the same time in the Philippines to be aligned with this uh, race to the bottom wages, and at the same time, the condition of workers uh, or the rights of the workers are being put at stake because their main policy and the labor uh, laws of the government is the contractualization or contractual labor. The Philippines right now is currently in another round of a lockdown, and in the world it is known as one of the most longest lockdowns since the pandemic began. And the people, trade union movement, and the Filipino people are calling for accountability for from the government for the misprioritization and the allocation of budget that is mostly spent on military and police budget instead of actually giving priority to the pandemic response and the people's needs. So now that we are in another round of lockdown, the people are asking the government where is the relief, where's the aid and the support for the people at the time of this pandemic.
Thank you, Kara, for that information. I think I'd also like to take off from very important keywords that you mentioned earlier: the openness, the race to the bottom, and the foreign direct investment. When we talk about the labor condition at the present, we also must talk about the labor market, and it is also important to understand the state and rate of industrial growth in the Philippines. So, industrial growth in the Philippines has been dismal since the declaration of independence from Spain in 1898, and that has greatly impacted the labor condition at the present moment, what Kara was sharing earlier. In terms of the industrial growth in a historical timeline, since the 1940s, or even after our declaration of independence from the United States in 1946, primarily um, colonial masters have imposed many policies that has stifled industrialization in the country. in 1995, during the time that the Philippines became a signatory for the World Trade Organization, the situation further worsened. And this is what Kara was saying in the part where she mentioned about the openness, the drive of the neoliberal globalization to continue opening the economies of developing countries into more foreign direct investments. That has resulted to the consistent decline of industry share in the Philippines. And fast forward to present, the surge in investment, the increase in the share of service sector, and the decline in the share of agricultural and industry sector in our gross domestic product can be also attributed to the race to the bottom, wherein workers have to bear the diminishing wages and benefits and are exposed to various forms of precarity and occupational health hazards at work. And in the Philippines, this is what we are experiencing right now. It did not just happen overnight. It's centuries long um, perpetrated by our former neo-colonial masters, and at present by multinational corporations and those who belong to the 1%.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. And this is really vital information. And from what you were saying, I'm already drawing connections between what is happening or has been happening in places like India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan. And I was wondering if I could further push you on this, if I could push you a little further to kind of understand what these impacts have been. And also in terms of, are there any labor codes or labor laws in the Philippines to protect the workers? And if so, how are they being used?
I think um, what remains important to understand is that the major driving force of the economy is the workers and their productivity. And at present, the productivity of the workers is very much in positive terms, even amid the pandemic. But even with a huge increase in labor productivity, their wages remain low. So in simple terms, labor productivity in the Philippines continues to rise, where workers' wages are still at a very low and remain stagnant in terms of growth. And this is very similar to many countries in Southeast Asia and developing countries worldwide. And this is mostly because of the neoliberal principle of openness, the adherence to policies that often deregulate labor and employment in developing countries. And yes, we may have national laws that govern labor relations, and we do have a labor code in the Philippines, but many other policies, sometimes policies brought about by joining free trade agreements or bilateral agreements, etc. Many other policies, economic policies, come into play and have circumvented the fundamental rights that have been guaranteed in the labor code of the Philippines. So one example I would cite is the rampant practice of contractualization in the Philippines. In our labor code, when a worker has rendered work for 6 months, or when he or she has rendered work for 1 year, if not continuous, then he or she should be a regular worker. But many labor flexibilization, internal and external, have been used to circumvent this provision in the labor code. And that is very obvious in many department orders from the Department of Labor and Employment, nonetheless, in the Philippines. And maybe Kara can also add a little bit on that.
Thank you, Rochelle. Can I bring Kara into the conversation, Kara, to add to this?
To add to that, it is, well, we do actually have the labor code, as mentioned by Rochelle, and it should protect workers from any violation of workers' rights and people's rights. But then, even the labor code states, Article 296 of the labor code states that after 6 months of probationary work, any worker should be regularized and as such receive the benefits of being a regular worker. So that, of course, includes the right to organization, to the right to form a union, and to bargain with the management. But then as said by Rochelle, it has been companies have found ways to circumvent this. So that we have the contractual deviation scheme that's happening in the Philippines, and they call it a lot. They have a lot of terms for it. There's 555, there's ENDO, and other casual work and others. So it's 555 because some of the companies have found a way that after 5 months of being at work, workers are forced to leave, or their contracts are only up until 5 months, and after that they can't be they aren't able to organize themselves and to gain their rights to union and to bargain. And then of course, there's also the labor export policy, as known in the Philippines as one of the producers of migrant workers. More than thousands of Filipinos per day have to leave the country in order to find work outside the country. So in the Philippines, where the conditions where contractual work is proliferating, so contractual workers will get even less to get a minimum wage, which isn't even enough to provide for their families. And the conditions in workplaces are very difficult. They are forced to go outside, find a livelihood to provide for their families, but then even outside the country, Filipinos are subject to mistreatment, to different violations of human rights.
Yeah, thank you, Kara. I think that is a really important thing to focus on as well. That it is not only the internal labor force, but also the economy of countries like Philippines is sustained by a lot of remittance, which comes in from external migration. Could I ask you to maybe further elaborate that on, like, what are the conditions of the workers who leave and go abroad?
To begin with, I could mention some names: Flor Contemplacion, Sarah Balabagan, and Mary Jane Veloso. These are women migrant workers who have been subject to violations of human rights while they were working outside the country. And well, a global uproar on the issue of Flor Contemplacion happened uh, because she was executed without any evidences on the cases, the charges filed against her. Uh, and there's also the recent pandemic that affected the migrant workers. Most of them, thousands, have been repatriated, but then others remain outside the country subject to violations of their basic rights. Maybe Rochelle could also add to it.
Yeah, we used to say in EILER that more often than not, migrant Filipino workers abroad are subjected to mainly domestic jobs. A lot of those who go out of the country for work are mostly women,
Yeah.
and then they're also subjected to dirty jobs, sometimes degrading jobs, and they have no access to decent work and living wages as well. And I think this is very common also to many experiences of our neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, largely because the countries in Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines, um, has no sustainable industries in place, has no national industries in place. So they rely heavily on the export of labor and the inward remittances that come after that to keep the economy afloat while maintaining the backwardness of agriculture development in many of these Asian countries. So we tend to see similar patterns, similar situation specifically among women migrant workers. And, worst case scenario, they are subjected to death penalty. And, what happens is that they are not covered, their fundamental rights are not guaranteed by the labor code in place in the country of destination, and nor they are covered by the labor code from the country of origin. So it's a very tricky situation for the migrant workers, putting them in a more vulnerable situation than any other sectors, especially the women workers, women migrant workers.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for this. I just also wanted to ask you, because Kara had already started talking about the pandemic and its effects on workers, and as you were talking about that you're in the middle of one of the longest lockdowns in the world. So, what has been the effect of the pandemic specifically on both work and the workers in Philippines?
I think to begin with, that's a very difficult question to answer considering the so many underlying contexts pre-pandemic and how it has exacerbated the impact of the pandemic. I think one of those underlying contexts is that for the fourth time in a row, the Philippines is one of the top 10 worst countries in the world for workers. So even before the pandemic, we are subjected to the Filipino workers are subjected to precarious working conditions, and then the harassment and the intimidation that goes beyond the workplaces. Come pandemic, when everything is deemed suspended, including legal processes that should adhere to the protection of workers' rights, to the protection of workers' rights and welfare, we can see a rise in the cases of intimidation, harassment, and extrajudicial killings. So under the Duterte regime, there has been 56 trade unionists and labor rights defenders who have been victims of extrajudicial killings. And we are also the worst country for journalists. So people working in the field of broadcast journalism and media are also subjected to extreme threats and violence while they are performing their duty, while they are performing work. We are also the worst countries for environmental land rights defenders. So this also includes, peasants and farmers and agricultural workers, the number of which is really staggering. At the moment, it has reached about 300 environmental and land rights defenders, victims of extrajudicial killings. So that is in terms of the harassment, the violent, the fascist attacks against people and working people, including the working poor. When we talk about economic rights, as I've mentioned early on, certain policies have been released by the Department of Labor and Employment, and that has greatly impacted also the kind of working conditions that the workers are experiencing. So let me name a few. First and foremost is the Department Labor Advisory number 17, which was released early on in March, the beginning of the lockdown in the Philippines. And at the beginning, the absence of work due to COVID-19 exposure was shouldered by the workers through their own sick leaves, meaning no benefits except for what is basically guaranteed on the labor law. Fast forward some months after, what we would consider later on as a great victory for the workers worldwide, COVID-19 in many countries has been acknowledged as a workplace health issue. So now we are a step further into achieving benefits and, for example, paid pandemic leave that is supposed to be given to the workers when they contract COVID-19. But that is not yet implemented right now. The bill remains in the hands of our lawmakers in the Congress. But that is a step forward. So, but at the beginning, that was the case. When you contracted COVID-19, you should just take your sick leave and be with it for 5 days, because that is what is only allowed in the labor code. But science and facts would tell you that you have to have 14 days of quarantine. The second order I wanted to emphasize is the department order on the issuance of 13th month pay for the companies will be suspended during the pandemic. But this was easily shut down by the workers. It's a basic right. Your 13th month pay is the basic right, and there shouldn't be any law, order, or announcement or pronouncement that should be said and implemented that would go against this. And finally, um, the Department Order number 215 is another a problem being faced by the worker right now, as that order leaves the employers to decide on whether or not the suspension of the employment of the worker will exceed 6 months or not. And going back to what I was saying in terms of the labor code, if you have rendered 6 months of work or have rendered 1 month of work, not continuously, meaning then you should be regularized, right?
Yeah.
But with this department order, it further postpones your status of regularization, and that denies the worker of the benefits, right to minimum wage, right to security of tenure, and many other fundamental rights that is supposed to be given to the worker. So those are the three policies that I could think of right at this moment that has been released at the time of the COVID-19 and has greatly impacted the worker situation.
To add to that,
Yeah.
economic statistics and rates have reached historic highs. For example, more than 10 million were unemployed and underemployed, as recorded by the government data by at the beginning of this year. Inflation rate has reached more than 6%, and continues to rise every year, and especially during the pandemic. Our GDP reached, I think, negative 10% of growth. So there's no growth at all. Um, so these numbers, these statistics show how workers were affected, and the policies in place have not protected the workers. So, for example, there's no increase in the minimum wage of workers. There's no relief or cash aid given to the people in order for them to buy the necessary commodities amid rising prices. And because of the inflation that continues to soar every time, the real value of the minimum wage, which is roughly 10 US dollars for the National Capital Region. It has this The real minimum wage has decreased to less than to around 8 US dollars per day. So that's only for those who are receiving minimum wage per day, and not everyone has access to the minimum wage, especially if they are contractual workers, if they are casual workers, if they are not employed rightfully by employers. So aside from that, at the start of the pandemic, since all kinds of public transportation were halted, a lot of jeepney drivers, members of the informal sector, were also forced to beg in the streets. The jeepneys, the main public transportation in the country, could not serve essential workers who were supposed to go to work at the time of the pandemic. And at the same time, jeepney drivers who had no other means of living aside from, of course, driving and serving the people who needed transport, they were forced to beg in the streets, and that's one of the main issues in the country. And at the same time, at the onset of the pandemic, um, a lot also of thousands of urban poor communities were locked down without any food supply and aid from the government, which also forced them to leave their houses even amid the pandemic, even amid a health crisis, because they didn't have anything to eat to provide for the family, and they were either arrested or subjected to beatings by the police. And records show that more than 20,000 cases of pandemic related harassment, beatings done by the police just was 20,000 cases of harassments and beatings by the police were done amid the pandemic. So those are some of the happenings, and at the same time, um, COVID response has not improved. So at the beginning, we have been calling for the government to improve mass testing, to add budget for public health facilities to protect health workers and frontliners. That until now we haven't. The public health system has completely broken down, and we haven't had any means to keep up with the rising number of COVID-19 cases and the different infections in the Philippines. So that's how people are trying to get by in a country where um, poverty is almost a norm and state legalized by the or put in place by different state policies. We are forced to either choose between going to work and finding means to live and provide for our families um, in exchange of our health and our safety.
Yeah, that's absolutely shocking, Kara. But then, again, I'm drawing similarities between what is happening across the world, that governments are taking this opportunity of COVID-19 to, further exploit workers, to further infringe on labor codes, to further bringing in measures of contractualization, like Rochelle was talking about, but also governments treating this pandemic as a law and order crisis rather than a health related crisis or a care related crisis. Um, and I just wanted to ask you that you were saying that a lot of workers have lost their jobs. And has the government done anything to like arrange for alternate livelihood or food supply for the workers currently? And in the context of like, I also want to, because we were talking about women workers, and so just wanted to specifically ask you, because the women workers not only have the responsibility of work, they also have the responsibility of care work. And so in this case, how have the women workers been affected? Kara, would you like to set us off, and then we can move to Rochelle after that?
I could share one of the case studies that we have done where a woman worker from Haynes Philippines Incorporated, which is a global clothing brand, was retrenched amid the pandemic, with more than 800 women workers also. They were supposed to be regularized last 2018, but the Department of Labor turned over the order, and only less than 19% were regularized in their company, alongside other companies who were also found to be conducting labor-only contract policy. So that's where we're coming from the 2017 decisions and findings, where companies were found to be employing labor-only contract workers, and from that year, they weren't able to they weren't regularized as should be implemented in the company. So now that amid the pandemic just last year, Haynes workers were retrenched from their work and without receiving any benefits. So now they're trying to get by working, and they're forced to find work in other factories and other companies, and also they're also trying to work at their own homes. So that's kind of like they're trying to make clothing pieces at their houses, and then that's how they provide to other companies or small businesses that need their help. And then there's also we have also women leaders, workers, union and the unions that we are, and the sorry, we also have women workers from our trade unions who advise their children not to find any work because it's the time at the time of the pandemic, and then they would surely be subjected to drastic work conditions, contractual work, very low wages that would it wouldn't suffice. The wages wouldn't suffice for the hard work, for the basic needs and commodities that they would have to spend in going to work and providing for their families.
Yes, thank you, Kara. Those two studies and situations that you share is not actually very different from the majority. We were able to find some data from Center for Women's Resources, or CWR, in the Philippines, indicating that there are around 16 million Filipino women who are economically insecure and are subjected to um, economic conditions that are burdensome and making them more vulnerable to exploitation and lower wages and even worse harassment at work and worsening conditions at work. Generally, in relation to what you asked earlier on job creation amid the time of the pandemic, many women in the Philippines do not are not really able to access quality and decent jobs, primarily because only the service sector has been generating jobs. And this is also related to what we're sharing earlier, that the policy of the government to keep the Philippine economy afloat is to implement labor export policy, or to attract more foreign direct investments to invest in service sector, particularly business process outsourcing. And that in turn is obviously very outward in the sense that all the wealth generated also goes out of the country and does not trickle down to those who are the real driving forces of the economy, including women workers. So, in turn, Filipino women do not really have access to decent and quality jobs in sustainable industries such as in agriculture and manufacturing. And when they do get the job, they are exposed to situations as what Kara has shared earlier. And I'd also like to put emphasis on the fact that during the pandemic, the rise in domestic violence against women and their children is absolutely undeniable. There were statistics from UNFPA, or the United Nations Populations Fund, indicating that there are about 751,000 unplanned pregnancies last year during the time of the pandemic, and many more women, including working women, were not able to access reproductive health and family planning services due to restrictions and lockdowns and many other community quarantine policies that have restricted mobility in many regions in the Philippines. Likewise, there is also an estimated 26% maternal deaths incidence, and that is equivalent to additional 60 women experiencing maternal deaths just last year. And that means that more and more women um, performing care work also are exposed to certain vulnerabilities um, that they should have access to remedies but don't, because many of the policies during the lockdown does not really match the concrete conditions on the ground, including in the household. And lastly, I also want to add that women um, compose majority of healthcare workers globally. That's 7 out of 10. And in the Philippines, where the healthcare system is in a very tight spot, in a very difficult situation. Women health workers are also subjected to longer hours of work, lower pay than what they're supposed to have, and in the absence of proper benefits and paid pandemic leave, they're also lacking access to additional income that could close the gap in bridging their needs for their everyday lives and the needs that has come out because of the impact of the pandemic. So all of that combined puts Filipino women workers and Filipino women in a very vulnerable situation, much worse than what we have seen in the recent decades.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was a lot of really valuable information. Uh, at this point of time, I want to ask you, how has the trade union movement in Philippines reacted to specifically what is happening to work and workers during the pandemic? And you've already mentioned, both you and Kara have mentioned the amount of state and police repression that the activists, both activists and workers, have been facing during that time. So if I could ask you about that as well.
Kilusang Mayo Uno and other trade union centers in the Philippines have campaigned for our campaign banner last year was medical solutions instead of military lockdown. So that's one of the main banners of campaign that we used last year to criticize the government's response on the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein he focused, he allotted a big amount of budget for military and police spending instead of increasing um, public health fundings and increasing mass testing capacity and other necessities and needs for the people. At the onset of the pandemic, we called for the passage of the paid pandemic leave. It's one of the bills that is currently in the Congress, to ensure that workers, especially those who were infected by the COVID-19 virus, and others who are also um, who are others who are affected by it outside, even outside workplaces, have a way of ensuring economic and health security amid pandemic. So that's one of the bills that we passed in the Congress. And also we are calling for the Duterte government to pass the security of tenure bill, which has long been passed even before the pandemic. There's also the national minimum wage bill, passed even before the pandemic. And then now we are also calling for daily wage subsidy. So that's different from the wage increase in such a way that we are calling, since there's a pandemic and there's an economic crisis due to the growing inflation in the country, we have to subsidize the lost wages of workers by the government. So that's part of the daily wage subsidy, which is also part of a bigger cash aid program that should be implemented by the government, since a lot of people are affected by the pandemic, and especially during lockdowns, we aren't able to go to work, or we aren't able to find any means of livelihood to provide for their families. So one of the main calls that we are doing now is the immediate, sustained, and sufficient cash aid for workers and for all those who are affected during the pandemic. And at the same time, our uh, trade unions also pushed for CBA negotiations amid the pandemic. So a lot of the companies delayed the CBA negotiations because of the pandemic. But then when the people have adjusted to the pandemic, they began to push for the CBA negotiations in order to also gain benefits and protection amid the pandemic. So there's one union who pushed for the inclusion of enhanced community quarantine as part of the calamity benefits, wherein at the time of a lockdown, very strict implementation of lockdown, or we call it enhanced community quarantine, that the workers are paid, and aside from that, they are given benefits from the company. And at the same time, other unions also collected their smock gowns. These are one gowns like similar to hospital gowns. They collected their old smock gowns and donated it to the hospitals in need of additional medical equipment additional medical equipment, and of course, personal protective equipment in their hospitals. So, and another thing is that we also held relief operations for the displaced jeepney drivers and urban poor communities. We also held and these relief operations were funded by workers themselves. So we called for donations from them, unions who are able to give um, uh, whatever amount they can, help to provide for meals, face masks, and others to be given to those in need. And at the same time, and now during another lockdown, the government said that charity work should be banned, or they're not allowing charity work since they since during the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of organizations, trade union movements held relief operations and community pantries. So now we are continuing this through Meals on Wheels, giving hot meals to the homeless people. And so the work of the union movement is first calling for the Congress, the Senate, and the government to pass the bills related to the protection, economic and health protection of workers and other sectors affected by the pandemic. And we, in the local level, in union levels, the unions have successfully concluded their CBAs to protect their rights, and another part of union work, we have relief operations, community drives to community relief operations and community pantries to help the poor and those in need. So I think that's one of the major works of the trade union movement. And at the same time, of course, we are fighting against um, all forms of repression, since these, especially the unions, have successfully concluded their CBAs. They're currently under attack right now. They're facing state repression. So the government and its anti-communist agents, they call it the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, have been red tagging, um, harassing union leaders. They've been visiting the houses of union members to force their disaffiliation from KMU, and and others also were arbitrarily arrested. As mentioned a while ago, more than 32 trade union leaders and organizers are currently detained, and worst, of course, some of our union leaders were killed by state agents during the pandemic. So, but amid these attacks on workers, we are trying to continue. We are trying to continue our work, and we are also filing cases in the Commission on Human Rights, the National Bureau of Investigation, to investigate these attacks against workers and to protect our members.
Thank you so much, Kara. Rochelle, would you like to add something in this context?
I absolutely agree with everything that Kara has just said. And coming from a labor NGO and seeing how vital the role of a militant trade union is in this very difficult and trying times, in the middle of attacks and direct violence committed against our trade unionists and labor rights defenders. I think one important lesson that we've learned is that the citizen-led responses, including worker-led responses, are vital in addressing pandemic situation, and are crucial in providing immediate responses, especially in communities of workers and other vulnerable sectors, members of the society. I'd like to take off where Kara was sharing earlier about relief missions, for example. EILER, in partnership also with many unions, are participating in relief missions. One also with KMU and other labor organizations in the Philippines. We call it Tulong Obrero. In English, it means workers helping. In essence, it means workers helping other workers and other vulnerable sectors of the society affected by the pandemic. And this citizen-led responses, this collective action of worker-led responses is a testament also to the inaction of the government, that instead of providing effective responses and implementing laws that would safeguard fundamental rights of the workers, it is implementing militarized lockdowns in the guise of enhanced community quarantine, and further perpetrating violence through its National Task Force to End Communism in the Philippines, as if saying that trade unionists are communists. That makes no sense at all. And it's also saying as if communists are terrorists, basically labeling everyone, terror tagging everyone in the name of its war on terror and whole of nation approach. And finally, also, I think at this point, I'd like to say that um, seeing how KMU faced a lot of the attacks, particularly during the pandemic, the red tagging, the disaffiliation, those methods specifically target militant trade unions, such as Kilusang Mayo Uno in particular, because they are very vocal, they are at the forefront of demanding better policies, saying and exposing what the government has been doing wrong. And of course, that creates a lot of friction and conflict. Hence, they are targeted, harassed, and worse, their members are being killed. And at this point, I think we at EILER would like to say that we express solidarity with many unions, such as Kilusang Mayo Uno and other unions across the globe who are facing intimidation and threats for organizing into trade unions. We support the idea that people-led economic recovery and resilience through building and strengthening our unions is vital in terms of promoting the rights of the people and sustainability of our economy and of our environment in time of the pandemic. And now more than ever, as the pandemic continues, as the economic crisis continue to worsen, as those in power continue to exploit cheap labor and find new ways to deregulate labor and employment, such as in gig economy right now, workers need a collective voice and action through unions to ensure that their fundamental rights and freedoms in workplaces and in the supply chain across the globe are protected and upheld. So we definitely support the demands that Kara has elaborated earlier on, and we continue to express our solidarity with every unions in the world in saying that power needs to be given to the unions, and trade unions are vital in making safe spaces, making sure that workplaces and sectors are safe from precarious working conditions and are safe from poor pay and are safe from harassment at work, so that these things do not become the new normal. We need a better normal, and trade unions are at the forefront of that struggle towards a better normal.
Thank you, Rochelle, for such a strong message. I have one last question, and you both may have, I think, have covered it in bits and pieces. But I just wanted to ask you that what is the Filipino government's recovery for strategy for COVID recovery now? And what, according to you, should happen for the workers of the world now in Philippines, in the context of Philippines? So, if Rochelle, you could start, and then we'll pass on to Kara. So these are just end comments.
Yeah, this is not to say that the government has not, put out policies to respond to the pandemic. Of course, it has, but the thing is, it is mostly to bail out corporations and does not really pay attention to the demands of the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which constitutes majority of the enterprises in the Philippines and employs a huge number of Filipino workers in the country. So since a lot of the policies do not respond to that, and instead policies such as the Create Law, which further provide uh, tax exemptions to big corporations, are implemented, that's completely bailing out the corporations, and a show of promise that it will continue the neoliberal policies that it has been implementing since the administration sat in its position. And so really, when it comes to simple terms, there's no genuine policy that genuinely responds to the current pandemic context. For example, workers are demanding a basic wage subsidy of just 100 pesos, very small, but it is enough to add to their take-home income, and at least, at the very least, provide meals on the table. And it's a very humane demand, and very timely and very timely and concretely grounded on the situation of the workers, completely ignored. And instead, the government wanted to focus on further exempting corporations from taxes. And when I keep on talking about taxes, because resource mobilization is important when it comes to addressing the pandemic situation. We need huge amounts of money, of financial resources to cover a lot of things. And taxes from corporations are supposed to be returned to the public for social benefits, for social good. But instead of doing that, and it's very obvious that we have to do that, the government is purposely ignoring that. And so you will see which side the government is on. So at this point, it is very anti-worker, it is very anti-poor. Instead of providing concrete responses, it has resource to militarize lockdown in order to create a climate of fear, to silence the voices that have become critical of its responses. And again, and that has resulted to a number of extrajudicial killing, thousands of harassments, and thousands of unlawful and arbitrary arrests, not just of workers, but many other sectors, many other members of the vulnerable sectors.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Kara, can I pass over to you for end comments?
Okay. To sum up the Philippine government's response on the COVID-19, because for sure they they have done things, but to sum it up, the government's COVID-19 response is anti-people, anti-worker, and military centric. So it has not focused on providing support, providing security for the people, providing food for the people. It has focused on spending huge amounts of foreign debt and public fundings for military spending, for attacks against the people, for attacks against those who are critical to the Duterte government. And for now, we have given the government steps to be done in order to that should be done in order to be able to address the current pandemic that we are facing. We have told the government time and again that we have to focus on medical solutions and on proper economic aid for the people, instead of focusing on military approach on the pandemic. So we have told the government time and again that there should be improved mass testing, contact tracing, quarantine facilities, support for the public health system and frontliners, and at the same time, economic aid, cash aid for the people, for them to be able to provide for their families at this time of the pandemic, where everyone's jobs, everyone's employment, everyone's livelihoods are at stake. And at the same time, we are calling for the government to stop the different kinds of attacks we are demanding for our rights, for basic necessities, for basic humane rights that should be given to the people not only during a pandemic, but at any given time. And the government keeps on refusing to address our demands, our needs, and instead, they're tagging us communists, they're tagging us terrorists, and on these false accusations and charges, they're using this to continue to justify the attacks, the killings, the arbitrary arrests and harassments on the people, on our unionists. So, um, so looking forward, violence, harassment, poverty has become a norm in the country even before the pandemic. We are facing a health crisis, an economic crisis, um, and at the same time that we are calling for proper government response to these problems that we are facing, they should address our just demands uh, calling instead of attacking, instead of calling us terrorists. So looking forward,
Mm.
the trade union movement and the people have begun taking for we have taken part in citizen response and people's response. We have actively helped each other, poor helping the poor, workers helping each other. We have held relief operations and seminars to help each other get by during this time, but it is not enough. It is the government's responsibility, and it is our right to be given the demands that we are asking for. So, in solidarity also with workers outside the Philippines and other parts of the globe who are facing the same conditions as us, um, the government and even the system, the global system, has
Mm.
always prioritized profit over the rights of the people. And in order for us to get by another pandemic or any other crisis, we need to prioritize the people, the workers who are trying to provide for the economy for everyone around the world because um, and so with that we give our solidarity to the workers and other parts of the globe, and we are asking also for support for the Filipino people um, as we campaign for their rights and we continue our organizing work, um, and because we are facing the same enemy, we are facing the same conditions. It is only right and just for us to unite and fight for our rights um, and our just demands.
I think the workers' demands that Kara has earlier mentioned are very clear, very concrete, and are actually very legitimate and simple in terms. So apart from hearing those out and implementing policies that should answer directly to those, I'd also like to emphasize a couple of major public demands that we've been able to gather. First is strengthening the healthcare system in the Philippines and ending the privatization of healthcare, not just in the Philippines, but all around the world. And this is because we've seen how, in a health uh, crisis situation, public hospitals are vital. And those who are working, including the working poor, um, can only access public hospitals and small hospitals in the regions. So it is very important, if any, the pandemic has shown how important it is to strengthen and build our health system. So a national and public healthcare system must be put into place. And this is the right time, if not earlier on, this is the right time to
Yeah.
do it. And in relation to that, this is also, and this would be my last point, this is also the right time to put the alternatives into place. As we have seen, neoliberalization has failed. Even the IMF and the World Bank have said so. And obviously, it is failing us now and has put us into the brink of a collapse of a system. And what is the alternative to that? In the Philippines, we have to put the national industries in place in order to generate decent and quality jobs. And in the countryside, we have to implement land reforms, genuine land reforms, in order to address the situation of our farm workers and farmers, which comprises the majority of the population. And also in the pandemic, food producers are very vital, and yet the government is ignoring them. So, if any, now is the time to build national industries and to implement land reforms. And this is the kind of economic model that we are looking at in terms of sustainability and in terms of its benefits for the people and the just share in the fruits of the labor.
So much, Rochelle and Kara. I think we have ended on the perfect note with a message of sustainability, with a message of land reform, but also a message of global solidarity. Because, like hearing both of you speak, I was drawing so many similarities with what is happening across the world. It's the same story over and over again of the complete collapse of the public health system, of the complete collapse of workers' rights, and the government taking advantage of all of this to push the interests of corporations rather than the people. So thank you so much for highlighting all of this and speaking about it from the context of Philippines. We are really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us.